always kind of disturbing to hear, but it was really good foundational information, so thank you for that. My name is Kimberly Dudik. I'm a state representative here in Montana, and I'm in my 4th year in the legislature and running for the House right now for re-election. We have to run every 2 years. I'm also an attorney. Before I was that, I was a registered nurse. I was a domestic violence advocate, so I appreciated everything you had to say. I'm going to be talking about one specific type of sexual violence, and it's human trafficking. And so that's why Hilly went first, just to provide a nice overview for many different things. But we'll be talking about human trafficking. And before I get started in my presentation, we're going to play 2 short videos for you to give you a feel for human trafficking in Montana and what we're seeing in our state. Go ahead and start that.
Welcome back. Human trafficking in Montana. In the past 5 years, the state has made progress on how it handles cases of it. But one group in particular says it's still not enough. ABC Fox Montana's Taylor Chase continues our investigation.
Here on the reservation, there's really no one person to go to about what exactly human trafficking is. So it's been here, but it's still new to people.
Although there isn't yet data to support claims that human trafficking is happening more often on reservations, tribal members say human trafficking incidents are occurring almost daily on the Fort Peck Reservation in northeastern Montana. That's due to a combination of cultural and societal factors.
You'd have to understand our culture. Our children on reservations, they can roam very freely because in our community, we're extended family members. We know who belongs to who.
Add that to the high rates of unemployment and drug use, and Native American children become an easy target.
In our society right now, we have a significant amount of grandparents raising grandchildren. Okay? And the parents are absent, even some themselves are absent. A grandma needs to know when her grandchild's 14 years old is coming home with all these other jackets and boots, and a 30-year-old man's outside waiting for them.
Brian Lockerbie with the Montana Department of Justice agrees and says physical characteristics also play a factor.
Native American kids are exotic, unfortunately, in the sexually perverse culture that exists out there. They have a different look, a little darker skin tone, more olive skin, dark hair, dark eyes, which is something that's kind of appealing to some of these sexual offenders.
Yet if state law enforcement has increased awareness and training, and Montana law now punishes more severely, why are incidents happening daily according to tribal leaders?
Right now, law enforcement, a lot of the victims I've worked with, sexual assault, domestic violence victims, they don't trust law enforcement. Just because there's a high turnover and nothing's usually done.
And logistically, enforcement on tribal lands is not easy.
You know, only federal agencies have authority on tribal land other than the law enforcement, the tribal law enforcement. Well, keep in mind that human trafficking knows no borders. So you go from reservation to state to another state, and everybody's trying to work this, and everybody's jurisdiction stops at different locations. We have to find ways to fix those jurisdictional issues so that we can manage some of those on the enforcement side.
Last year, those issues were put to the test when a so-called spiritual leader visited the Fort Peck Reservation. Not long after his arrival, tribal leaders discovered that his true intentions were not to help the tribes, but instead to traffic young Native American girls. The tribes acted quickly and took matters into their own hands.
But this violation is so heinous to us that we said no. We're going to exercise an inherent power that we have never exercised before because an event has never been so egregious. We exercise inherent power of banishment right from the council chambers, and it held.
And while this case had a clear ending, residents on and off the reservations are still learning to recognize and understand a new disease that has entered tribal lands.
So now let's say we were successful. We rescued this person. Social services doesn't know how to deal with them. They have never encountered somebody like this. They don't understand what it's like to have to ask permission to take a shower.
It was all the pleasure of sin. That's really what it was. And it took advantage of people that were already beaten down, already devalued since they were very little.
Reporting in Great Falls, I'm Taylor Chase.
Now, if you or someone you know is a victim of human trafficking, there is help available. Please call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. It's totally anonymous. You can get that help The number there on your screen, 1-888-373-7888.
So that's one of the videos. You heard from Brian Lockerbie. He's our Montana state head for the Department of Criminal Investigation in our state. He's very interested in this issue. He used to be the head of law enforcement in Great Falls, and there he specialized in protecting children. So he is a great resource we have in our state and has really been trying to address this issue. He touched on a few of the issues we see is people are vulnerable. They don't trust authority, and we don't have the resources to help people once they get out of the system. So this is a new area in Montana that we're trying to figure out what to do, and we've made some progress in that. All right, now we'll watch one more short video and then go into the presentation. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Trafficking is a worldwide problem, but turns out it hits close to home.
Yeah, it sure does. Here's one reason why. Interstate 90. It begins in Washington State. It cuts across Montana. And for traffickers, it is easy access and easy to travel on. Montana's Attorney General gave us 8 specific cases of human trafficking involving Montanans since 2011. Now, they emphasized that is by no means a complete list of what has happened in Montana. Lauren Brady met with one law enforcement officer who knows all too well just how prevalent the crime is.
Guy Baker works for the FBI. He's a part of a task force team that aims to combat human trafficking. He knows all too well the problem is prevalent, but people aren't aware of it.
For the average person, it's easy to picture, an abused or partially dressed or naked female chained to the floor in some basement, and they relate to that as a human trafficking victim. But most of the time, that's not the way it is.
There's been 6 human trafficking cases in Missoula over the last 3 to 4 years. Remember this man? In 2012, Clifton Oliver pleaded guilty to running a sex business with minors in Missoula and Kalispell. There are other cases that involve local human traffickers and ones from out of town.
I think it's just, I don't know if it's growing. I think it's just as strong as it ever was. And there's common traffic that comes through Missoula from Washington that goes all the way to the Bakken.
Baker tells me traffickers will use sites like these, Backpage, to place ads offering sex. Those ads are found under the escort section. But authorities struggle because victims don't usually come forward.
It's difficult for law enforcement a lot of times because these type of victims don't self-identify as victims and they're not cooperative with law enforcement. And so it makes it difficult during contact with law enforcement for the police to identify them as victims also.
That's why he's talking to us. Baker hopes the more people know, the more eyes will be on the lookout. Reporting in Missoula, Lauren Bradley, NBC Montana.
Thanks, Lauren. And today we learned that for the first time, the Montana Board of Crime Control is tracking cases of human trafficking. Experts tell us it's like trying to follow a trail of smoke. To put it all in perspective, every year, approximately 800,000 to 900,000 victims of trafficking are moved across international borders worldwide. In the United States alone, the Montana Attorney General's office estimates 300,000 children are trafficked for sex every year. The average age of a girl forced into the trade, 12 to 14, and the estimates are less than 2% will ever know a different life.
Those are some really real statistics, aren't they? So that's human trafficking in Montana in a few seconds. Now we're going to go into some more details. Please ask questions if you have questions as we go through this, because I'd love to answer them, anything you have. So go ahead. We're going to be talking about human trafficking in Montana. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. We'll see how smoothly this goes. The program I used didn't do it, so we're doing it through a PDF. So let's see. There you go. Yeah. All right. So human trafficking, what is it? It's basically modern day slavery. It's the sale of human beings as commodities. It's forcing people to work in labor or perform sexual acts against their will, and it's done through force, fraud, or coercion. When it comes to children, it doesn't have to be through force, fraud, or coercion, though, because they're children and they're treated specially. Next slide. Go ahead. And she stepped off, so hold on. I'll just keep going. All right, so what is my next slide? So we're talking about, you saw that 1-800 number. That's a national number through the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And anyone throughout the United States can call that and receive access to help. And you can also go to a website called the Polaris Project, and that tracks states, what their laws are, what their statistics are for what trafficking they have, and you can see what's going on in our state. It also scores states based on what our laws are and what we're seeing. So human trafficking entraps, depending upon what statistics you look at, an estimated 27 million people throughout the world at any given time. 27 million people. It's the second most profitable criminal activity in the world, second only to illegal drug trafficking, and the market is valued at least $32 billion. I just saw that at the International Labor Organization valued it at $150 billion. So it's hard to track and actually estimate how much it's worth because it's illegal. But we know that it's worth billions of dollars and people are being forced to work against their will. Most of the people forced to work are women. When it comes to sex trafficking, you have at least 60% are women and girls or children. Other statistics have 12% of men are forced into trafficking, 66% of women, and 22% are children. So it is a problem throughout the world, but it's also a problem here in our state. Next slide. So here in Montana, our Montana statistics, this is from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. They provide statistics, and I can provide a link to this, so if you guys can't see it, we can go ahead and give you that link. But in Montana, these are just phone calls to the actual hotline we have. There were 74 hotline calls. And there was one email. We have the 39th highest call volume in the United States. 34% of the calls are from community members who are concerned about what they're seeing in their towns. 12% of the victims were possible labor exploitation, where people were first forced to work against their will. And 11% were victims of sex trafficking. Those are estimates because we don't really know exactly who they were reporting on, but that's what we have reported there. We also know that in 2015, go ahead to the next slide, the Polaris Project, which I told you is that national organization, they've reported that there were 150 victims in Montana that were showing moderate to high risk of being human trafficking victims. Now we heard from the law enforcement officers earlier in those videos that there were eight confirmed cases. Those are confirmed cases. Most of it doesn't get caught, doesn't get reported, doesn't get investigated or prosecuted. So we're looking at hundreds of people who are victimized in our state every year. So next slide. Child sex trafficking is particularly egregious. Like we said, there's an estimated 300,000 children who are sexually trafficked in the United States every year. The average age, as you heard, was 12 to 14-year-olds, and the victim of choice is typically a 12 to 14-year-old girl. The pimps can have an average of 4 to 6 girls that they work. It's a reusable commodity, not like drugs that's used once, but they typically make these girls, force them to have sex 20 to 48 times a day. And this is kind of an ugly topic, so if you're uncomfortable, let me know. We have to talk about it because, as Hilly was saying, we have to know. Ignorance doesn't help us at all. We have to know about this and bring light to it. So the average pimp will force a victim to have sex 20 to 48 times per day, and they can make $150,000 to $200,000 per child per year. So these are reusable commodities that they're forcing children to have sex. And next slide. Montana law, though, has improved, greatly protecting children in our state. You'll be happy to know that Montana was previously rated, let's see, changes in the law. Before I get on, let me make sure I don't get ahead of myself. We are currently, that goes later, I'm going to wait. So Montana law has changed. In 2015, we passed a bill called House Bill 89 in the legislative session. And this was a bill that I passed with the help of Attorney General Tim Fox. It had a lot of bipartisan support, and it significantly restructured our human trafficking laws in our state. It provided for greater protection for victims, especially children. It provided clear definitions of what human trafficking is, and it made access to victim services easier for victims. So that's, in a broad sense, what we did. So we also required offenders, who are not only the traffickers, but also the purchasers of the sex, to register as sex offenders. Because they are sex offenders, they're like a rapist, they should have to register like anybody else has to. And by doing this, we're hoping to go after the demand. There are campaigns such as the End of the Demand campaign, by trying to stop the person who's purchasing sex from sex trafficking victims, try to stop them from actually purchasing that, wanting to purchase it, so you stop the demand and eventually there will no longer be a use for that commodity. That's the thought behind it. In Sweden, they've seen that when you publicize names of people who are involved with sex trafficking, that suddenly the rates of it go down greatly, because people don't want their name out there. And typically when somebody gets arrested for sex trafficking, they'll say, oh God, is my wife going to find out? Not am I victimizing the child, am I forcing somebody to have sex, but will my wife find out? So the answer to that is, yes, your wife will find out, and so will everybody else in the world, because your name's going to be online with the registered sex offenders. So, yes, that was my personal thing that I wanted to make sure was in our law, because it's a big deal, and hopefully it will help end the demand. And that's what we're trying to go after. So go ahead to the next slide. Go ahead, next slide. So one other thing that we did, we substantially changed our laws in Montana. We created a civil cause of action for somebody who was trafficked against the perpetrator or the purchaser. So basically, if somebody is a sex trafficking victim, they get out, possibly by law enforcement intervention, by social service intervention. They now can sue their trafficker, their pimp, for the money they made off of them, for the physical harm that they inflicted on them, for the emotional harm that they inflicted on them. Any cause of action that a creative lawyer can think of, they can sue for. They can also sue the purchaser of the sex, because that's the one who's helping perpetuate this crime. So we now have a civil cause of action in our state, and that's again to try and find some equality for these victims. Next slide. We also have what's called a criminal forfeiture of property. And this is when somebody has been convicted of a sex trafficking offense. Any property that was utilized in that offense or that was purchased with the proceeds from that offense can be seized by law enforcement, and the person has to give it up. So the person who's made $150,000 to $200,000 per year per child doesn't get to keep that money and wait till they get out of prison. They have to forfeit it. And so that's going after their profit.
Where does that money then go?
It goes, we have a crime victim compensation account, so somebody goes to the crime victim compensation account, and that's something else that we did with this law. Go ahead to the next slide. We made crime victims for sex trafficking eligible for the crime victim compensation account. We also set up a human trafficking education account, which doesn't have any money in it yet, but the fund itself exists so that if an organization wants to donate money to help with human trafficking to the state through the Department of Justice, they can. And they needed somewhere to house that money, so we created a fund for that. The other thing that we did to protect victims is what Hilly was talking about so much, is when somebody is raped, they don't want to go forward because their entire life is going to be on display. They will be torn apart as a victim. And that's what we don't want to see for human trafficking victims. So we've made it so that their past sexual history is not admissible in court action. It's the same kind of rape shield protection that's provided to a rape victim. And so we're hoping that with prosecutions, this will help. Next slide. So improved protection for children. This is one thing that I love. So in Montana, sometimes we're a little bit behind the times on things, right? We kind of get, movies a little bit late. Everything's a little bit later here. I love Montana, I'm from here, but I wouldn't live anywhere else. Well, one thing that we lead the nation in is we're #1 in protecting children from sex trafficking in the entire nation. And this is because of the law we passed this last legislative session. The Shared Hope International ranks states for how well they protect. And we did have a D ranking, which, in school, not so good. deranking is pretty bad. But we passed this comprehensive bill that really protects children, treats them like victims, doesn't allow them to be looked at as a child prostitute, because a child can't be a prostitute, they're a victim. It allows them to be treated as a youth in need of care, and it eliminates their criminal liability for prostitution. It really treats them as victims. And we went from a D ranking to an A. We might as well be an A+ because we're now the #1 ranked state in the nation for protecting child victims of sex trafficking, which is pretty cool. And so, good for us in Montana, because we're leading the way in something. You don't have to show that a child was forced to sell themselves through force, fraud, or coercion. That's what you have to show with an adult. But it's not what you have to show with a child, because a child is a child and they're treated separately. And they deserve special protection. Go ahead to the next state, the next flag. Sorry, the next thing, red flags. So red flags, people want to know, well, what can I do? How do I know what to do? How can I help? You guys are taking this first step that you need to do is you are learning about this. We need to spread the knowledge about human trafficking in our state. People need to know about it, they need to talk to other people about it, and if they see something that they think is not quite right, they need to report it. So that's what we need to do. We're going to go over some red flags right now. So go ahead to the next. Did anybody have a question there? Yes.
At some point I need to ask this, how do you protect, or how do you decide, I'm not minimalizing the problem, but occasionally there's some child that wants to get back at an adult or something, they want to pay them back, so that's a good way for them to hurt somebody, is to accuse them. And it's been proven in court that occasionally this has happened, that the man was innocent, but that the child accused them to get their way.
I know that there are reports that, and people believe, like as you said, that children will make up instances of sexual abuse to possibly get at the adult. That's not quite what we're talking about here, but just to address that itself, because I do deal with child sexual abuse issues a bit. The instances of children lying about sexual abuse are very rare, and typically through a law enforcement investigation that would come to light. And that's what we hope is you have a thorough law enforcement investigation with Child Protective Services so they can ferret out any issues like that. So that's what we're hoping to see. With sex trafficking, though, it's not typically somebody saying, my father is abusing me. It's more like, this is John, and John is my friend who I travel from state to state with, and he gives me money, and I do things in exchange for it, like sell my body. So it's a little bit kind of a different dynamic than what you see with the typical sex abuse case, but thank you for the question. So red flags. Common things that you see, this is with labor trafficking, which we haven't talked a lot about, but it does happen in our state. And with labor trafficking, you typically see it in, let's see. The primary venue is with forced labor, manual labor, those sorts of things is with labor trafficking. And for red flags for that is you'll see an individual who possibly can't come and go as they please from their house or from their job, or they're under 18 and providing commercial sex acts. So that goes back to the sex trafficking. And they may also be interested in selling themselves for sex, and they have a pimp. That is a sign of sex trafficking when it comes to minors, because minors by themselves cannot be prostitutes by the law. They may be unpaid for labor trafficking or paid very little, or they're only paid through tips. So if you start talking to someone or you hear about someone, something doesn't seem quite right, that's one of the signs of labor trafficking. They also may not be allowed to have breaks. They have unusual work restrictions, like they can't go anywhere. Just things that seem a bit odd as far as work goes. They also owe a large debt to their employer, or their employer has their green card, or their employer has maybe their ID, their birth certificate, their driver's license, and they can't get it from them. Those are signs of labor trafficking. They also may have been recruited through false promises. You hear about this sometimes in the news where somebody was told that they could go somewhere and be a model, and then before they know it, they're actually working, sometimes as a sex slave, or even through forced labor at a hotel, where they actually end up cleaning rooms. but they didn't know what they were getting into. And there's also really high security measures that exist at work or living locations that seem just strange. If something seems strange to you, the thing you should do is call 911 and make a report. If you're not really quite sure what to do, call the Polaris Project. They have, or call the Human Trafficking Resource Center 1-800 number and ask them about it. Just say, you know, this doesn't seem quite right to me. What do you think? The next slide. Other things to look at are poor mental health and abnormal behavior. Go ahead to the next slide. And this is when you meet someone. We're trying to talk to people in service industries or maybe who work at Walmart or who work at a hotel, and they actually interface a lot with human trafficking victims and don't realize it. Because hotels are where we see a lot of human trafficking, sex trafficking occurring, but they also have to go places where things are cheap with their pimp or with their person who is forcing them to be trafficked and buy goods like clothes, tampons, makeup, things like that. So typically they'll be at the less expensive stores. So we're trying to reach people. You'll see someone who's fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or really nervous. They might be, if law enforcement is brought up, they might just act really, really nervous or scared about something. You could also ask them how they're doing, and they might act really fearful, afraid to answer, or they won't answer on their own. They avoid eye contact a lot, and it's just, they don't want to interact with you. So go ahead to the next slide. Other warning signs when you're talking with them. Go ahead to the next slide. Is you'll see other warning signs like they'll lack health care. They won't be able to seek any sort of health care for anything. Like they may have something wrong where obviously they should have health care and they aren't getting it. They may appear malnourished. They're not going to be the healthiest people because they won't be fed really well or a healthy diet. And also in healthcare, these are also places where you might see somebody come in with a venereal disease or something like that in the emergency room or some sort of trauma. And that's actually a good opportunity to interface with some of the victims and get them help. They also can show signs of physical or sexual abuse, confinement, restraint, torture, cigarette burns, bruising or something on their wrists. Things that just aren't normal, but they aren't seeking help for it. Those are all red flags. Go ahead to the next slide. They also lack control. They have few personal possessions. They don't have things that are theirs. They don't have a lot of clothes. They won't have a car. They aren't in control of their own money. They don't have any sort of checkbook. They don't have any sort of check card, debit card, or type of ID typically. They won't be able to access their driver's license. They may not have one. They don't have any sort of passport. And they're not allowed to speak for themselves. They're typically having a third party answer for them. Like you could ask them a question, but they won't be the one to answer and they may not even look at you. And the other person will answer for them. Those are all red flags that human trafficking can be occurring. Go ahead to the next slide. Some other additional warning signs are that when you talk to a person, you say, oh, where are you from? Oh, I'm from all around. I'm just visiting. Things they don't really tell you where they're from. Everybody has a home somewhere. But they won't really have that information. They also may not have an address and they may not even really know where they are. Like they typically go from state to state with sex trafficking and they're advertised like you saw on Backpage.com. If you're not familiar with that, it's probably a good thing. It's the Craigslist of human trafficking and prostitution. So Craigslist used to have a private section where you could get escort services and they cut that list, and when they did that, but pages like Backpage.com came up, and people are basically selling escort services with pictures. And if you look at the pictures, the people are obviously not, some of them, old enough. And if you track it from city to city, you'll see that they're in Spokane, they're in Boise, they're in Missoula, they're in Great Falls, they're in Billings. And you can see that it's the same person, same picture, typically a young-looking girl saying, only in town for a few days, looking for some fun, can't wait to see you. I'm pretty sure she's a sex trafficking victim. But the problem with law enforcement is they can't interact soon enough with them, and typically they're gone. So it's very challenging for our law enforcement officers to actually interact and stop this human trafficking. It's a brand new area, like you're hearing them say. And so it's taking new sorts of investigation and protection for people. Other things that victims may have is they may not know what time it is, what day it is, just kind of seem out of it. Sometimes trafficking victims will be drugged up by their trafficker, given heroin, which is making a resurgence in our state, if you didn't know. Heroin's big here now. And meth is making a real comeback. And those two drugs can typically keep people pretty hooked and pretty non-combative with things. So they may just seem kind of out of it, not know what time it is or day it is. And they have a lot of inconsistencies when they talk to you about who they are and what they're doing. Those are all red flags. So go ahead to the next one. So this is just, again, this is the general, that's everything we just went through. But I've handed you out, if any of you grab those handouts we have here, some other things that I wanted to go over with you. One thing that we wanted to talk about was how to keep our kids safe. Because it's pretty scary, 12 to 14-year-old girls. So who's a prime victim? Well, it's people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. People who come from previous instances of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. There's one report that said over 60% of trafficking victims who were children came from the child welfare system, or the foster care system, because they don't have a strong support system and they run away. And when a child runs away, within 48 hours, they're typically approached by a trafficker to get involved in sex trafficking. That's what we're seeing. So when children run away, they are placing themselves in very vulnerable situations. But also children who don't run away. Sex trafficking, human trafficking happens everywhere, in rural towns, in urban towns, small places, large places. And they're looking for children who are looking for some kind of contact that they aren't getting at home. Maybe they have parents who are unresponsive. Maybe they've suffered a lot of trauma in their life, or they come from abusive home situations that aren't getting addressed. Maybe they come from a very impoverished area where there's not a lot of opportunities. We're seeing some, Zana Toole from the Department of Justice, she runs a child protection, they have a child justice center. And she's saying that you're seeing a lot of children who are actually trading sex as survival sex. So they aren't really being forced into it as much as they have nothing else that they can do. So they are in fact trading sex for their basic living expenses. And that kind of act gets them linked up with people who will eventually traffic them and force them to do it when they're not really so willing. So things that we can do to protect our kids are, first of all, learn about things ourselves. We need to learn about human trafficking and talk to them about it. But kids need to be a little bit more internet savvy, and they need to know not to post personal information online. It's out there forever, for everyone. Do you really want everyone seeing that what you're doing, going out with your friends, where you're at, your home address, that if you're looking, oh, you're so upset over breaking up with your boyfriend or something, you're going to be getting friend requests from people who aren't really your friends. So kids need to be educated about that. Don't post your personal information. Don't add people to your friend list on Facebook or other sites that you don't know. Some people just go through lists and friend everyone. They try and find people who they think maybe they have pictures of them drinking at parties. They're like, oh, that person might be one that I can get caught up with. Go ahead.
Where are you guys seeing this at? Where is the most common area in Montana?
Okay, so on one of those slides,
You want me to go back one?
no, you don't have to because I can tell you, but I'll just pull it up. So on the handouts that I have, in one of the slides, it actually shows the state, and where we're seeing it, it has little red marks. And this is on the Polaris project, you can go to it, but we're seeing it in all the major metropolitan areas. What you'll see sometimes in Montana and in North Dakota is that there's been a real uptick in human trafficking, especially from, unfortunately, Native American reservations, because they're so, like you'd heard up there on one of the videos, the children are mobile. They move a lot. They have a lot of freedom of movement, and what they're seeing is that people will say, be it their cousin, their friend, their family member, say, hey, let's go to North Dakota and make some money this weekend.
So that's the Fort Peck Reservation.
And the Bakken.
And the Bakken area. And what they're seeing, so the money that's being made is not their male friend or family member who's making it, it's the girl who's going with them and engaged in sex acts. So that's how people are getting into this. It's friends and family members, it's not always strangers, which is unsettling. You know?
Well, I'm just curious because I've never really heard of it in this area.
Well, I've
So
worked-
You have it up in
that's
this
why-
area.
I've worked with 3 kids in the last year who
Mhm.
disappeared into this and then somehow we died. Yep. Uh-huh.
Yeah, this is a problem here. So the Billings Gazette ran an article, and it's not specific to this area, but it talks about the grooming that goes on in Montana and with sex trafficking victims in general. And they're victimized, in small and large towns, but what you'll see is that kids sometimes come to a larger town without many resources. They come there because they're looking, for some fun, maybe to get away from home, maybe just for some other opportunities, but they don't have a lot of resources themselves. And it makes them vulnerable to the people approaching them and saying, hey, I can help you out, why don't you come with me? And frequently it becomes a girlfriend-boyfriend situation, but then the boyfriend starts prostituting them out. And they say, well, we need to do this to make some money, and it'll only happen once. I mean, it just goes like that. You said you have to treat it 3 years. Is that similar to what you've seen? Some of it.
Some of it, high-risk kids, and then a lot of substance abuse.
Yeah.
And so because we have a big drug route through here too, so they'll meet somebody, they won't really remember, but they probably got high at a party, and somebody's friend of a friend who is basically dealing drugs in this area, they're now in that car going back into Washington or something, and they basically keep these girls
So I guess
high as a kite for
what
like 4
I'm
months.
getting at is, I guess a lot of us don't see it as sexual trafficking.
Right.
We just see it as prostituting.
Right.
So that's where
But
I
the
think a
kids-
lot of us are confused. I don't know, we work
Oh,
with
but
it
they
all
don't
the
see
time.
it, but they don't see it as prostitution either, like when you're on a therapist, when I'm working with them, I'm like, oh my gosh, my girl, like this happened. And they're like, well, like they were just there, and I was kind of high, and I got some, they bought me a hamburger, and it's kind of that exchange for basic needs, and they're so
But a lot of
into it.
people don't see it as that.
Well, no,
That's
they're
what I'm
not,
saying.
that's right, and the kids aren't seeing
Yeah,
that yet,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, and that's the scary part, is how many kids are experiencing this.
exactly,
And
they don't know.
nobody, and they don't even know
Yeah.
that this is what's happening.
Right.
And that's,
So one thing that we did with the laws that we changed this last session, and this is another one of the handouts that you have in front of you, but we clearly defined what human trafficking is, because we are coming across problems like that, not only with people knowing it, but with law enforcement charging it as aggravated prostitution instead of human trafficking. And they're 2 very different things, and so we clearly defined human trafficking, and I'll read it to you so you can hear what it is. It's when a person commits the offense of trafficking of persons if they purposely or knowingly recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, receive, provide, obtain, isolate, maintain, or entice another person, knowing that the person will be subjected to involuntary servitude or sexual servitude, or if that person benefits financially from having another person engage in those acts. So that's what trafficking in persons is. And we upped the penalties for this. We made it consistent with some uniform laws in our nation. And the sentence is 15 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000. But if it's a child, we made it more stiff, and it's up to 50 years in prison and a $100,000 fine. And you'll see that consistently, and that's why we're one of the leading states in protecting children, is we really amped up everything for kids. Did you have anything else? Okay. And then involuntary servitude, we've talked about that a bit. We don't see as much involuntary servitude here. We're seeing more sex trafficking that's being reported. That could just be because we aren't really seeing it yet. It's hard to detect these things, and law enforcement is trying to develop new ways to do that. But with involuntary servitude, I just want to read to you what these are so that you have an idea of what our law says in Montana. It's if a person purposely or knowingly uses coercion to compel another to provide labor or services, unless the conduct is permissible under state or federal law. And that little caveat in there was actually for having children, like help on family farms and stuff. We had some people in the legislature who didn't want to pass this comprehensive human trafficking law because they thought that they couldn't make their kids work on their farms, which I understand. It was a concern, and so we actually made it clear that that isn't what we're talking about here. We aren't talking about having your family and your kid go do some work. And that's the same sorts of penalties we saw for the other trafficking. The sexual servitude, you didn't want to work on the farm anymore, did you? So the sexual servitude is when a person uses coercion or deception to compel an adult to engage in commercial sexual activity. So it's different than prostitution, because with prostitution is when a person knowingly wants to go do it. Like, I'm gonna go make, $1 million because I'm gonna go have some sex tonight and charge someone for it. That's because you're willingly doing it. But using, forcing another to do it, using deception or compulsion, that's when it goes to human trafficking, as the person is not necessarily voluntarily doing it. So it is a little different.
And if they're a minor, no matter what, it's...
25 years or $75,000.
But if they're a minor, no matter
If they're
what,
a
it's
minor,
human trafficking.
I'm sorry, yes. There is no defense that a child consented to the sexual activity or that the adult thought the child was an adult. So that's typically what you would see in these cases. Like, oh, I thought she was 18 even though she looks 12. Doesn't matter. So if you're going to be paying to have sex with somebody, you should probably figure out how old they are. It's kind of what the take-home message is there. And then another, the last thing that I'll say is we defined patronizing the victim of sexual servitude. And this goes after the demand. This goes after the Johns who are paying for the sex. And so this is committed when a person purposely or knowingly gives, agrees to give, or offers to give anything of value so that a person may engage in sexual activity with either them or with another person. So, and this is prison up to 15 years or $50,000 and the same fine of 20, if it's a child, of $75,000 up to that, or 25 years in prison. And again, it's no defense if the person thought the child was an adult. Doesn't matter. So we are pretty strongly protecting children in our state. There are aggravating circumstances, such as if somebody entices a child from a shelter to come in with them. There are 5 years that can be put onto any of these sentences. If they obtain the consent from somebody who is a foster child, if they're homeless, or if the person is a victim, they subjected them to domestic violence or sexual assault. Those things are all can give you an extra 5 years on all those sentences. And those are called aggravating circumstances that make it especially heinous, so we're giving you a little bit more of a sentence because you did it.
How soon can they get out on parole, though?
That depends. So that depends on what they have to do as part of their sentence. There is no mandatory that you have to serve a certain amount of time before you be eligible for parole. So unfortunately, that is not something we have. What we were hoping to see is that we would have more human trafficking prosecutions in the state, and we have had some, but we were told that they still have stiffer sentences for aggravated prostitution. So we're still getting some human trafficking cases charged as aggravated prostitution because they have a harsher penalty for the trafficker. So this next coming legislative session, starting in January, that's something we're going to address. And we're going to be making that not a confusion in the system, because then what we see is that we don't get enough human trafficking cases reported in our state. They're promoted as prostitution. They're reported as prostitution when in fact they're not. They're human trafficking. So we have to change that up. Another thing that we're looking at doing is doing something to regulate the internet, which is really hard because there are some federal laws there that make it very difficult. But what some states have done is they've made anyone who posts online in their state for services, such as on Backpage.com, that they have to verify the identity, the age, and the address of a person who is posting before it can be posted. So there have been other states that have passed that. It hasn't been ruled unconstitutional yet or in violation of any federal law. So I'm hopeful that that's something that we can get through in our legislature. And an interesting thing that they've seen is all these posts online have various numbers to call and contact. They did a study in California where there was thousands upon thousands of numbers to call for escort services. But when those were actually tracked back to where they came from originally, out of the thousands of calls and everyone, they came back, I think, 50 unique locations or so. So if we could do some sort of tracking in our state as to where actually these calls are coming from, and we could, rather than kind of play whack-a-mole and get, the people when they actually come up to the surface and arrest them, we could go after the people who are behind this and who are really engineering it. But that's a law enforcement, something that we need resources for in our state. And we're in a bit of a disadvantage there because we're such a small state population-wise. We don't have a lot of numbers to necessarily provide the statistics like they do in California. So it's something that we're working on and that we're aware of, and it could be a really good way to help combat human trafficking in our state. But as it is now, we are a leader in human trafficking law and protection, and we're doing a lot to help victims. There's better data tracking now, so we'll see how we can help people. And hopefully, we're definitely protecting children. And as we learn more, get more statistics, we can figure out what better services they need and what can be done. One state in North Dakota, North Dakota is a state, one town in North Dakota called Newtown, North Dakota. This is kind of interesting. I think it's applicable to special tribal jurisdictions. They passed a law that would allow the tribal courts to prosecute human trafficking when it didn't rise to the level of a federal prosecution. Because as we talk about jurisdictions, the state doesn't have the ability to prosecute here, but federally it does. But the federal government that has to say as to whether or not to prosecute it if it doesn't meet federal requirements. But the tribal jurisdiction could possibly pass their own law that would allow prosecutions in tribal court and therefore help more victims and hold more offenders accountable. It's just something that I just recently came across, and I thought that it's something that maybe more tribal jurisdictions could look at exploring as a way to helping the people there. So that's what I have to give you guys. I'll take questions. Go ahead.
I think I read where in a lot of instances, even the victim of the trafficking was put in jail when they were found out, and the perpetrator and the victim were both in jail.
Right.
Because of the prostitution angle, or?
I believe it is. And so that's one thing. We also created an affirmative defense, which means that if you're charged with prostitution, if you can say, I'm actually a human trafficking victim, then you won't be charged with that crime. But it is when people are initially taken in from the facts that are presented, that does happen. And that's unfortunate, but it does happen. Yes?
I was just wondering, you touched on this a little bit, if you have any statistics on successful prosecutions.
Successful prosecutions? Well, I don't. I know Ole Olson is one of the prosecutors who does a lot of that, as well as Dan Jackson in our state, doing it statewide and federally. But as far as their numbers, they are pretty low just because we don't have the number of cases. But I could find out the most recent information and see what that is. But it's relatively low. And like I said, a lot of it is also charged as aggravated prostitution. There's just a case in the last couple of months that was charged as that because of the penalty. And it was obviously a human trafficking case, and so we talked to them about why it was charged that way, and it was because they liked the penalty for aggravated prostitution better. So that needs to be changed. Yes?
The number of cases being low, is that because, or do you think it might be because people don't recognize it as trafficking, and then the victims don't report?
Yes.
I mean, I saw a video yesterday that was sent to me by a faith-based organization, and this girl said a neighbor moved in, and for 2 years he abused her, and she had to show up at 3 o'clock certain days, and she was scared to tell her parents, and she never reported it to anyone, you know. And I have this fear that, you know, there are people out there that are victims that don't know what to do. That's what she said. I didn't know what to do.
I think that you've hit a key point there, is they don't know what to do, and they may not want to necessarily partake in the services that are available. In situations like that, she didn't know what to do, and one way we can change that is by changing the conversation and the norms of our society and accepting that human trafficking occurs. It's modern day slavery. People need to learn about it. Then they need to know what to do. Well, who could she call? She could call law enforcement, but she may not want to. She could have called a school counselor. But it's giving people the resources as to what they can do. And sometimes they just need somebody to say, are you okay? Or are you safe? And just asking those questions gives them the opportunity to say, actually, no, I need some help. But what you also will see is that the person doesn't want the help, the services that are available. They may just want to go home and act like nothing ever happened. They don't want to stay with social services or anything like that, especially teenagers. They just want to go home. Or if they're in the foster care system or runaways, they don't want to have anybody in authority telling them what to do. So that's something that we're grappling with in our state, is how to appropriately provide services. There are some, I guess you could call them like halfway houses or rescue houses in our state, where they will take people who are human trafficking victims to live there and to get services. but they don't take that many, and also the people who would want to go there, who would be suitable to go there, may not want to, because they just want to go back to their life or be on their own.
I think a lot of 12 to 17-year-olds though don't have any idea that they're being trafficked.
Right.
Because they just think, well, we're going to party. They're getting illegal substances, whether it's drugs or alcohol, and they're gone partying, and they have sex and don't realize what's going on behind the scenes. But they thought they were just off on a party and it was a great time, and then they come back and they're asked to do it again and again and again, and pretty soon that's all they're doing.
Right. And I think that's more of an awareness raising. How do we talk to 12 to 17-year-olds? We've all been there. It's challenging, and we need to raise that awareness and let them know what it is and what they're exposing themselves to. Not just for that instant, but also in the future, that they could actually be exposing themselves to a lot of also health-related issues. And so it's just an awareness raising and making services available, as well as funding those services. Services like that, victim services, are not well funded in most states, but especially in our state. And that's a challenge that we have. Go ahead.
I had several questions I wanted, or just points of discussion. One is, I think the law enforcement in certain areas is guilty of adding to this problem by trying to entrap men. And I've heard situations where man was not at all interested, but they kept doing these pop-ups on the internet and got him entrapped and got him meeting with some underage girl. And I think that's a situation that needs to be looked at. I think they're adding to the problem.
Sure, and with situations like that, if there was an entrapment situation, that would be a defense that the person could bring when they were charged with something, and that would be something that a court would seriously look at, because for honest entrapment situations, nobody wants that occurring. And what were your other questions or comments?
The other issue is, I think the answer would be rather obvious. Do you think that a victim is subjected to cruel and unusual punishment? Punishment or cruel and unusual
behavior?
Yeah.
I would say so.
Okay. Now let me tell you this. I had a talk with somebody from the ACLU, and I said, one way you can stop this, a lot of this, is to have physical castration of these pimps and those that are predators. They say, oh, that'd be cruel and unusual punishment. What did the victim go through?
Right.
Now, you threaten one of these predators with physical castration, you're going to scare them to death.
Well, I'm not going to stand up here and say we should go castrate all criminals. What I am going to say is I think that a lot of us think an eye for an eye, and that we should use fear to stop people, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. But what studies have shown is that even just castrating somebody who's a sex offender doesn't stop them from their behavior. So it's not enough just to stop them. We still have to do something else to stop that behavior and change our society and what allows it to occur. But as far as punishments like that,
it'll stop a certain part.
It would definitely stop a certain part of it, I think. I do.
Well, this is part of the taboo. I mean, I'm old, and I was born in the early 40s. And sex, when I was growing up, was a taboo. You didn't talk about it. And I think some of that has hung over, even into today's society. And if we can't talk to our children, when I was young, my mom said to me, boys are going to want to get you to do something that I don't want you to do, so don't do it. That was my sex education. The something, I never figured out what it was. And then it was going around in school that you could get pregnant from kissing. And that's how they kept us in control, because we were scared to death, And that's gone now too. But some of that blaming the victim, it seems to me, is still going on. And as long as we hide all this, you know, we're helping those who I think would blame the victim. She should have done something, she should have told, you know, and they don't really know what's going on if their parents don't talk to them graphically and explain some of this stuff.
I agree with you. I think public education is a large part of how we change social norms and what we accept in our society. And talking about sex can be very uncomfortable for some people and may not happen in some families. So then you look at what role does the public have to play in it. And so that's always a challenge, and it's something that we struggle with as a society. But I agree that open communication and knowledge is really key to a lot of things.
So are these conversations happening right now in middle schools?
About what exactly? Not about castration. A sex education, that's a challenge in our state. We always have people.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Sex education now is not, I don't think it's called sex ed anymore, it's called health. But it seems like people are afraid of what their children are going to be learning at school. Like if they learn about something, they're going to suddenly engage in deviant behavior or something. And I think that we have so much knowledge out there on the social media as it is, and the internet can be a great thing, but it can also be a real bad thing. And that I think that we have a duty as a society. This isn't really human trafficking, but I think more as a community, we need to figure out how we can educate our young people and make them have a positive self-value and world that they're going to have, and that's up to us to do. And ignorance doesn't do that.
Just an anecdote, Guy Baker, the detective in the video, and a YWCA advocate who specializes in this area talked to the Missoula County public school system about doing some human trafficking education in middle school, and they came back and said, yes, if you promise not to talk about sex. I can't really do my presentation then because I will bleep out every third word I'm trying to talk to these kids about.
Right, and yeah, that's something that you're dealing with. But we are having different community events. Like one thing that I have it's somewhere around here. There's a little poster, and I can send the link also to Kathy. We are putting on a full day of human trafficking awareness events on May 27th. It's the Friday before Memorial Day weekend. And it'll start at 7:30 in the morning with what's called the Red Sands Project. And that's like a demonstration project, and it's happening throughout the nation where people get little packets of red sand and they spread them in the cracks to show, it's to signify visually about people falling through the cracks. And that happens with human trafficking. And it's just a way to raise awareness. We're doing that all in the university. We're hoping to do that on the University Oval at 7:30 in the morning. And then we're having a full day of conference from 8:30 till about 4:30 where Guy Baker, who you saw up there, is going to talk. Dana Toole, Kat Werner, who is the YWCA advocate she talks about, as well as Matt Dale from the Victim Services with the Department of Justice, and a few other people. Tim Fox, the Attorney General, will be there to kick it off probably. And so that'll be until 4:30, and then from 5:30 until about 7:30, we're having we call our Run for Freedom, and that's basically a fun run, 5K, at fun run or walk. You don't have to run it. It's just a way to have more community involvement and raise awareness of this issue, and it'll be a fun way to end the day on May 27th. And so if you're interested in those events at all, I have more information on those, but we're trying to raise awareness so people know about this situation in our state, what they can do about it, and really how they can impact it and make our state safer. So who else had a question? I thought somebody else had their hand.
I was just going to mention, if you send me that link, and if everybody picks up one of the scratch pads on the free table over there, that has our Facebook page address. I'm planning on posting the videos from tonight and the texts from both of the PowerPoint and the PDF, so that anybody that needs those texts can get them. And then I'll also post that flyer so that everybody can get that information if they're interested in these.
And I also put my card on the table there. I'm a state representative. My email address is on there. My phone number is not, but if any of you are interested, I could give that out also. And I'm also an attorney with a law firm in town, so and I provide victim services. So if you know anybody who is in need of some legal services, please feel free to contact me, because I will help as much as I can in that regard. Any more questions or conversation?
Well, if you're over in Helena and you bring up the castration issue and some man is against it, you say, no balls.
I will, and I'll say I was told to say that. All right, well, thank you all very much. It was nice talking with you. Thank you.